Rotterdam, in the spring of 1940, was a city teetering on the edge of annihilation, a city caught in the quiet before the storm, a city where the air seemed heavy with the scent of fear. The canals, once glinting in the morning sun, were now dull and murky, reflecting the gray, overcast sky like tarnished mirrors. Smoke hung thick over the rooftops, curling upward like ghostly fingers, a sinister reminder of the bombings that had already scarred parts of the city. Cobblestone streets, which had once echoed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the laughter of children, were now silent except for the distant whine of aircraft engines overhead, an omnipresent warning of death descending from the clouds. The city's once vibrant harbor, the lifeblood of Rotterdam, lay desolate. Shipping crates were overturned, warehouses lay in ruins, and abandoned boats bobbed listlessly in the water, their hulls splintered and scarred. Amid this fragile, trembling city, Lieutenant Hendrik van der Meer moved quietly, like a shadow blending with the smoke-streaked streets. A Dutch intelligence officer, he was not a man of heroic stature in the traditional sense. He was lean, wiry, with sharp, calculating eyes, and a quiet intensity that suggested a mind constantly at work, always analyzing, always anticipating. Hendrik had lived through the first days of the war with the grim understanding that survival was not about luck. It was about foresight, precision, and the small, often overlooked acts that could tip the balance between life and death. Hendrik's office, perched above a shuttered printing press near the edge of the harbor, was a narrow, dimly lit room filled with the scent of ink, paper, and the faint metallic tang of gunpowder lingering from distant explosions. Dust motes floated lazily in the weak beams of sunlight that filtered through grimy windows. On the battered wooden desk lay a city map, tattered from repeated use, edges frayed and corners stained with ink and graphite. It was covered in small marks and annotations, each representing a German military position, an area of suspected bombing, or a potential safe route for civilians. Beside the map, almost unremarkable, lay a simple yellow pencil, chipped at the edges and worn from hours of use. Most would have dismissed it as insignificant, an ordinary tool among countless others. But in Hendrik's hands, that pencil was more than wood and graphite. It was a lifeline, a scalpel with which he dissected chaos and mapped out survival. The first weeks of the bombing campaign had revealed a terrifying truth. The Nazi Luftwaffe was not indiscriminate in its attacks. Each strike was calculated, meticulously designed to break both infrastructure and spirit. Factories, schools, hospitals, bridges, and waterworks were not simply destroyed. They were used as instruments of psychological terror, targets chosen to maximize fear while crippling the city's ability to recover. Hendrik had realized early on that predicting the enemy's strategy, however tentatively, was the only way to save lives. He spent countless hours hunched over the map, pencil in hand, tracing flight paths, annotating patterns, and plotting evacuation routes. Each mark was deliberate, a small circle here to indicate a vulnerable factory, a jagged line to denote the path of potential destruction, and arrows guiding civilians away from danger. Every scribble represented a soul, a family hiding in a basement, a child playing unaware in the street, a baker preparing bread in a damaged kitchen. The weight of this responsibility pressed heavily on Hendrik, but he bore it with a quiet, relentless determination. Then came the breakthrough that would change everything. One gray morning in early May, Hendrik received a partially decoded German communiqué intercepted by Dutch resistance operatives. Its content was cryptic, filled with coded references to factories, waterworks, and urban sectors. But it was a roadmap to the next wave of bombings. Hendrik's pulse quickened as he scanned the lines of text. His pencil moved almost instinctively, translating the cryptic symbols into coordinates and risk zones on the map. He could almost visualize the path of destruction before it descended upon the city, and he understood that the next few hours could determine the survival of thousands. Hendrik's mind was a whirlwind of calculation. He recalled the layout of every street, every alley, every public square. He remembered the locations of hospitals and shelters, the strengths of cellars reinforced for survival, and the people who depended on guidance he alone could provide. With the pencil, he drew routes for evacuation, areas to avoid, and designated safe zones. It was meticulous work. A single miscalculation, a single misread signal could result in catastrophe. Yet Hendrik worked with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that even in the chaos of war, human ingenuity could carve paths of safety. Outside, the city seemed to hold its breath. Smoke drifted from distant rooftops where earlier raids had struck. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional clatter of debris or the muffled sobs of frightened civilians hiding in basements. But inside his office, Hendrik felt a strange sense of power. With this simple pencil, he could shape events, influence survival, and give the terrified citizens of Rotterdam a fighting chance. Each line was a promise. Follow this path, heed these instructions, and you may live to see another day. The pencil became more than a tool. It became an extension of his mind, a conduit for strategy and intuition. It translated intelligence into action and chaos into order. In its graphite markings lay the lives of children who would otherwise perish, the survival of families trapped in the labyrinthine streets, and the fragile hope of a city on the brink. For Hendrik, this small, humble instrument embodied the paradox of war, that sometimes survival did not rely on weapons, tanks, or armies, but on the precise, deliberate application of knowledge and foresight. As he worked, Hendrik recalled the people of Rotterdam. He remembered the baker, old and bent with age, who still delivered bread to neighbors despite the bombings. He remembered the young girl who insisted on carrying her doll everywhere, even through the chaos, and the street musician who played defiantly in the square, determined to bring music to a city under siege. Each person became more than a civilian. They were symbols of resilience, and every line Hendrik drew on the map was a lifeline to them. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside, the first sounds of approaching aircraft could be heard faintly in the distance. Hendrik's eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights, remained fixed on the map. The pencil danced across the paper, tracing corridors of safety, adjusting evacuation zones, and marking areas of imminent danger. He was aware that soon Rotterdam would be tested again, but for the first time in weeks, Hendrik felt a flicker of hope. The city could survive. The city could endure. And it would endure because of knowledge, precision, and, astonishingly, because of a simple pencil. The morning air was heavy with anticipation, a tense silence pressing down on Rotterdam like a living thing. Clouds hung low, gray and pregnant, almost as if the heavens themselves were bracing for the storm about to descend. Civilians moved like ghosts through the streets, their movements cautious, tentative, each footstep a reminder of the precariousness of life in a city under siege. Windows were boarded haphazardly, doors bolted, and street corners emptied of the usual clamor of daily commerce. The market square, once bustling with merchants, was silent except for the occasional cry of a child or the hurried shuffle of a woman guiding her family to shelter. Lieutenant Hendrik von der Meer moved among his volunteers with a quiet authority, the pencil still clutched in his hand. Though unremarkable in appearance, he carried the weight of an entire city's survival on his shoulders. His office had been a haven of planning, but now the plans had to be executed in the streets themselves. Notes were scrawled onto scraps of paper, pinned to doors, slipped under shutters, handed directly to terrified citizens. "Move east, avoid the docks, shelter in the municipal gym," one read. Another, hastily drawn with the pencil's tip worn thin, directed families to reinforced basements beneath the town hall. Each note was more than guidance. It was a lifeline, a tangible manifestation of hope in the shadow of impending death. Outside, the first drone of the German bombers could be heard faintly in the distance, a low, ominous hum that grew steadily louder. Civilians froze, their faces pale and drawn, scanning the sky for the deadly shapes that had already devastated parts of the city. Smoke drifted from buildings hit in earlier raids, curling over the rooftops in thin, poisonous tendrils. Horses whinnied nervously in stables, dogs barked, and in the distance, a factory alarm began its mournful wail. The city's nerves were frayed, but Hendrik's presence, calm and deliberate, offered a fragile anchor amidst the chaos. As the first wave of bombers descended, engines roaring like thunderclaps across the sky, Hendrik and his volunteers moved with precision. The evacuation routes he had drawn on the map were no longer abstract lines. They were paths of life, guiding citizens through twisting streets and alleys, past buildings that threatened to collapse, past obstacles left by hasty departures. The pencil's marks had become instructions etched into memory, repeated and reinforced by the volunteers as they shepherded people toward safety. Then the bombs fell. The city convulsed under the first explosions. Windows shattered, sending shards of glass cascading across the streets. Roofs caved in, and walls crumbled like sandcastles under a relentless tide. Clouds of dust rose into the air, swallowing entire streets in choking gray, and the deafening blasts reverberated through every corner of Rotterdam. Yet, despite the chaos, the evacuation routes held. Families reached the designated shelters. Children clutched to parents' chests, and terrified civilians descended into basements that would shield them from death above. Hendrik stayed in motion, moving from street to street, clipboard in one hand, pencil in the other, checking on the success of the evacuations, correcting deviations, and adjusting instructions as needed. Every second mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death. In a narrow alley, he redirected a group of families toward a reinforced school basement when he noticed that smoke from a nearby fire was drifting dangerously close. A volunteer, panting and wide-eyed, handed him another set of coordinates intercepted from German reconnaissance. Hendrik quickly annotated them on a small, tattered map he carried in his satchel, the pencil moving almost automatically across the page. From a vantage point above the central plaza, Hendrik surveyed the city as best he could. The smoke from distant fires obscured the skyline, twisting and curling in the wind, and the cacophony of destruction, explosions, falling masonry, cries of terror, was deafening. Yet in the streets below there was movement, discipline born of necessity. Families moved steadily, guided by notes, instructions shouted from volunteers' mouths, and the invisible guidance of the lines Hendrik had drawn. For the first time, the chaos of bombing was not entirely random. There was a system, a structure, and it was working. In the aftermath of the first wave, the city bore the scars of war. Entire blocks were flattened, roofs caved in, fires smoldered along the canals, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Yet, among the devastation, a fragile order persisted. Thousands of civilians had survived because of the lines Hendrik had drawn, the careful planning carried out with the pencil, and the coordination of volunteers who had become extensions of his will. It was a survival orchestrated not with guns or armor, but with intelligence, precision, and foresight. Even as the sirens wailed for the next wave of bombers, Hendrik allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The pencil, small and unassuming, lay in his hand, worn from use, smeared with graphite and ink. It was a humble object, yet it had become the axis on which survival turned. In that pencil, he saw the paradox of war. The smallest, most ordinary tools, when guided by knowledge and human ingenuity, could defy the most destructive forces imaginable. Volunteers whispered among themselves about the miracle pencil, though Hendrik dismissed the notion as sentimentality. There was no magic here, he insisted, only observation, analysis, and the relentless drive to protect human life. Yet, even he could not deny the surreal gravity of the situation. A simple piece of wood and graphite had determined the fate of thousands. It was a tool of survival in a world designed to snuff it out. The city trembled under the second wave of attacks, but by now, civilians were moving with a purpose, following the routes laid out by Hendrik's pencil. The baker who had delivered bread the day before now led a small convoy of families toward a shelter beneath the municipal gym. The street musician, his violin packed away, hurried alongside a group of children, urging them to safety. Every person who survived, every life preserved, was a testament to the power of observation, intellect, and the unassuming pencil that had traced lifelines across the streets of Rotterdam. By the end of the day, the city had endured, battered but alive. Smoke hung over the canals like a grim veil, fires smoldered in ruins, and dust coated every surface. Yet Rotterdam had survived in a way many thought impossible. Thousands were alive because of evacuation routes, designated shelters, and the careful orchestration of movement, all traced in graphite by Hendrik van der Meer. The pencil, unremarkable yet extraordinary, had become a silent hero, guiding lives away from death, turning intelligence into action, and giving hope to a city that had almost lost it. The days following the first wave of bombings brought no respite. Rotterdam had endured, but the threat loomed ever closer, like a predator circling its prey. Lieutenant Hendrik van der Meer rose each morning before dawn, the city still wrapped in the gray hush of uncertainty. Smoke lingered from the previous raids, drifting in lazy spirals that painted the sky with a poisonous haze. From his office above the printing press, Hendrik could hear the low rumble of engines in the distance, each drone a reminder that survival was a fleeting, fragile state. Hendrik's routine was relentless, unyielding. Every piece of intelligence that came through the resistance channels, intercepted messages, civilian reports, sightings of German reconnaissance flights, was scrutinized with meticulous care. The pencil, now worn down to a stub at the eraser end, danced across maps and notes with astonishing precision. He annotated, cross-referenced, recalculated, and redrew evacuation routes. Every mark represented countless variables: the structural integrity of buildings, the flight paths of enemy planes, wind direction, civilian density, and the unpredictable movements of frightened people. To outsiders, it was merely lines on paper. To Hendrik, it was the lifeblood of Rotterdam. Volunteers continued to play a crucial role. Ordinary citizens had become extraordinary, carrying Hendrik's hand-drawn instructions into the streets, interpreting coded warnings, and guiding families through the labyrinthine city. Every encounter was a test of nerve and precision. A misplaced step could bring devastation. A delayed warning could cost lives. Yet Hendrik observed, calculated, and adjusted. The pencil transformed chaos into a fragile lattice of survival, each line a conduit of hope. One morning, Hendrik received a fragment of intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. German reconnaissance had identified weak points in the city's evacuation system, the very routes he had painstakingly designed. The Luftwaffe intended to strike the municipal gym, now a critical shelter for thousands. Hendrik's fingers tightened around the pencil as he quickly redrafted plans. New paths were overlaid on the old, arrows redirecting evacuees away from imminent destruction. Volunteers were dispatched with urgent messages, weaving through the streets like threads in a tapestry of life-saving coordination. As the planes approached that day, Hendrik's office became a nerve center of controlled chaos. He moved swiftly, checking the status of each route, confirming that families had reached safety, and updating maps with the latest observations. Smoke and the smell of burning wood drifted in through open windows, mingling with the acrid scent of ink and graphite. The pencil became an extension of his mind, translating intelligence into immediate action. One swift stroke could alter the trajectory of survival, saving entire families from oblivion. In the streets, the city's resilience was palpable. Families moved in tense but coordinated lines, following the guidance etched into their minds from Hendrik's notes. A baker led children past a partially collapsed bridge. A seamstress directed neighbors to reinforced basements. A street musician, violin packed away, herded terrified civilians into a safe corridor. The pencil's influence was everywhere, unseen but omnipresent, guiding human behavior in ways that mere words or warnings could not. Hendrik's thoughts occasionally drifted to the human cost of the war. He thought of the young girl who refused to leave her doll behind, clutching it through each bombing raid. He thought of elderly neighbors who had survived the first wave only to face the uncertainty of the next. Each mark he made with the pencil was not just strategic, it was a promise that someone would survive to see another day. The weight of that responsibility pressed on him, but it also fueled an almost obsessive drive to protect as many lives as possible. By midweek, the Luftwaffe's strikes intensified, their bombs striking with brutal precision. Entire streets were flattened, fires consumed buildings in moments. The distant roar of engines became an omnipresent backdrop to the city's terror. And yet, despite the destruction, the evacuation networks held. Thanks to Hendrik's calculations, thousands of lives were spared. Families reached shelters intact. Neighborhoods avoided the worst of the devastation, and emergency responders could focus their efforts more effectively. The pencil, small and fragile, had become a weapon of defiance against mechanized death. Hendrik's obsession with precision and foresight did not go unnoticed by his volunteers. They whispered in awe about the miracle pencil, though Hendrik himself never claimed such a title. There was no miracle, only the careful application of knowledge, foresight, and the courage to act decisively when stakes were incomprehensibly high. Yet even Hendrik could not deny the almost surreal effectiveness of this simple instrument. It had allowed him to translate abstract intelligence into concrete action, to anticipate the enemy's moves, and to shield the lives of thousands with nothing more than a piece of wood and graphite. Each night, after the bombers had retreated, Hendrik would sit at his desk, pencil in hand, annotating maps with the latest intelligence and adjusting evacuation routes for the next assault. He became intimately familiar with every alley, every street, every building that could serve as sanctuary. In a city reduced to rubble by war, Hendrik's maps were a fragile blueprint of survival, and the pencil was the instrument that turned his insight into life-saving action. The people of Rotterdam, though battered and terrified, began to exhibit a quiet resilience. They followed instructions with precision, moved with purpose, and, in small ways, resisted the terror imposed upon them. The pencil, though silent, had become a symbol of that resilience. Each stroke represented human ingenuity triumphing over mechanical destruction. Each mark was a defiance, a statement that the city would not be broken. Hendrik understood the paradox fully. In a war dominated by bombs, tanks, and the merciless machinery of the Luftwaffe, it was a simple pencil, small, unassuming, almost invisible, that had the greatest power. It shaped survival, guided strategy, and preserved life in ways far more profound than any weapon of war. And as he looked at the worn graphite tip, the smeared ink stains, and the fragile wood, he felt an almost sacred responsibility. This pencil was not merely a tool. It was the city's guardian, a quiet instrument of defiance in a world consumed by violence. By mid-afternoon, the sky over Rotterdam had darkened, not with clouds alone, but with the foreboding shadows of German bombers that moved like predators hunting prey. The Luftwaffe had returned with renewed ferocity, their engines a relentless roar that vibrated through the streets and rattled the windows of even the strongest buildings. Smoke from earlier fires twisted into thick columns that stretched toward the heavens. and the air was heavy with the acrid stench of burning wood, charred masonry, and fear. Civilians cowered in basements, behind barricaded doors, or anywhere that offered even the slightest protection from the deadly rain of bombs above. Lieutenant Hendrik von der Meer was already in motion. His office, now a nerve center of precise coordination, had become a hub for volunteers and couriers who relayed information, distributed evacuation instructions, and checked on the progress of the thousands of civilians relying on Hendrik's plans. The pencil lay constantly in his hand, worn and smudged, an extension of thought itself. Every stroke represented a decision, a calculated attempt to outmaneuver death, and he moved with a focus that bordered on obsession. The first bombs fell with the terrifying inevitability of doom. Explosions tore through streets, sending masonry, wood, and fire skyward in clouds of choking dust and smoke. A nearby factory crumbled in moments, flames engulfing its structure and casting a hellish orange glow across the city. Civilians screamed as the shockwaves rattled doors, shattered windows, and threw debris into alleys. Panic threatened to undo all the careful planning, yet Hendrik and his volunteers moved with deliberate precision. Evacuation routes were adjusted in real time. Families who had been following one corridor were redirected by volunteers to safer passageways. A street that had been clear minutes ago now glowed with fire. Arrows penciled on maps were crossed out, new paths drawn with quick, sure strokes, and messengers darted through smoke-filled streets, shouting instructions above the roar of explosions. The pencil was the linchpin of every movement, translating intelligence into action and chaos into life-saving order. Hendrik's eyes scanned the city from the small window of his office. Entire blocks were flattened. The roar of destruction never ceased. Fires raged in patterns that could have overwhelmed any ordinary evacuation plan. Yet thousands were moving toward shelters, following the routes he had drawn, guided by the lines of graphite that mapped survival in the face of annihilation. The municipal gym, reinforced basements beneath the town hall, and a converted warehouse near the harbor had become sanctuaries. Families arrived there exhausted, covered in dust, but alive. Proof that every meticulous calculation, every stroke of the pencil had mattered. One moment, a volunteer arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, to report that a street designated as a safe corridor had been struck. Without hesitation, Hendrik grabbed the pencil and revised the route on a small map in his hand. He then dispatched another courier with the updated instructions, racing against time and smoke. The pencil's tip danced across the page, each stroke a potential lifeline, each line a barrier against death. It was almost surreal. The city's survival now depended on a simple wooden stick of graphite. In the streets, civilians demonstrated a quiet resilience that mirrored Hendrik's own determination. A baker who had led families through previous waves now guided another group of children past a partially collapsed bridge. A seamstress, carrying a bundle of blankets and supplies, directed neighbors to an alternate basement when the original shelter was threatened by flames. Even the street musician, violin case in hand, guided frightened children through alleys, herding them to safety with urgent gestures and shouted instructions. The pencil's influence was invisible yet omnipresent, a silent conductor orchestrating the dance of survival. Hours passed like minutes as the bombings continued. Each wave of Luftwaffe planes tested the city's resilience, probing for weaknesses, altering attack patterns, and pushing Hendrik's strategy to its limits. Yet, every time, the pencil proved its worth. Adjusted routes, updated shelters, and carefully relayed messages preserved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Hendrik realized, with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, that survival in this war did not belong solely to soldiers or weapons. It belonged to human ingenuity, foresight, and the meticulous application of knowledge. By late afternoon, the bombing began to subside. Smoke rose in thick columns, the acrid scent of fire hung over the streets, and the city lay battered, scarred, and trembling. Yet Rotterdam had endured. Thousands of civilians had survived the onslaught because of the careful orchestration of movement, the calculated application of intelligence, and the simple pencil that had traced lifelines across the city. Buildings were damaged, streets blocked, but life persisted. The pencil, humble and worn, had defied the machinery of war. Hendrik finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. He set the pencil down, its tip smeared with graphite, its eraser worn nearly to nothing. It was more than an instrument. It had been a guide, a guardian, a tool that translated thought into survival. In a city reduced to rubble and smoke, it had proven that intellect, precision, and care for human life could triumph over brute force. The volunteers, exhausted but alive, began to account for the families under their care. Children clutched parents' hands, the elderly emerged from cellars, and neighbors reunited amid the ruins. The streets, though scorched, hummed with the quiet relief of survival. Every life preserved was a testament to the power of planning, observation, and the pencil that had quietly shaped the course of the day. That evening, as the city settled into a tense quiet, Hendrik placed the pencil into a small wooden box, recognizing its significance. It was a simple object, unremarkable to anyone who did not understand its purpose, yet it had been central to Rotterdam's survival. It symbolized resilience, intellect, and human determination. The knowledge that even in the face of overwhelming destruction, ordinary tools, wielded with skill and care, could save thousands. And so, in the crucible of survival, the city learned a profound lesson. War was not only about weapons, bombs, or armies. Sometimes it was about the smallest instruments, the quietest actions, and the human mind capable of turning chaos into life. The pencil had been more than wood and graphite. It had been a lifeline, a silent hero in a city tested to its limits.